Greetings, everybody, and welcome into the Takeup. Happy to have you here on this Education Friday to talk about something that is strangely a little near and dear to my heart, or at least something I've certainly had a lot of time working on, which is brand management and working with larger kind of corporate entities, or at least distributed corporate entities for e-commerce. And in this case, I'm talking specifically about working with hospital groups and medical being one of the kind of chief places I spent my time in e-commerce. Did a lot of work with hospitals and medical, did a lot of work with real estate, and certainly did other kinds of business to business stuff, as well as team sports and the rest stuff that you might expect as kind of normal extensions of the custom apparel market. However, getting to work with hospitals and setting up an entire distribution system with hospitals is something that I had quite a lot of a hand in during my time as a commercial embroiderer. So I think it's something that's interesting to discuss, and it also brings up, as shown in the old that we keep ourselves on track and not run afoul of issues that might cause our customers to have like further compliance issues down the road or cause them to lose trust with us as far as this is going on. So today I wanted to talk about just a little bit about this concept of controlling brands, of what we do in order to make sure we set ourselves apart from the traditional, and I don't want to say this like in a pejorative fashion, but the traditional embroidery shop that may or may not care about things like our font choices, may or may not want to go the extra mile to have custom lettering done, to take that moment to make sure that there's a certain sort of corporate uh, code being followed as far as who and how things can be decorated, all that kind of stuff. It seems like it is tertiary, not even secondary. Like it's a third thing that you might not even consider when you're talking about trying to fulfill orders for a customer. But the ability to provide, especially if we're doing this in e-commerce, a clear chain, a clear chain of who is purchasing what, how they're purchasing it, and allowing them to create these standards so that people end up with the right garments that are worn at the right places and right times by the right people is really a massive value add, especially when they're trying to control this with direct sales. If you are eventually going to be servicing directly the employees of a company, the employees of a larger entity, then being able to control that stuff is really important. Also, part of this is just how do we set up for things as digitizers, like custom fonts. How did I originally do it? How did I kind of work through the process of originally taking in a bunch of these different divisions and different classifications that are under the same logo, and then eventually make these into something where I had a fully, typeset, ready to rock font that I could then use for those orders going forward, and that create a little bit of what we consider vendor lock-in. So we're going to talk about that. Certainly, I'm also going to, as I can, talk a little bit about the use case, the scenario, the way in which that we handled this business while we're at it as well. So it's not just going to be that digitizing alone or embroidery alone or e-commerce alone. It's a little bit of everything, so we can just talk about what the right clients are for that, how that works, and how we can service those folks best. So certainly I think that's what's really interesting about this stuff, is that it can be a little bit of everything, right? It can be a little bit of working with the files, and the digitizing portion of this is just as important to me as is how we present these in e-commerce, as is also what this means to our ability to sell, to understand what the right, the particular kind of mix or kind of person we want to work with would be for this particular setup. So, like I said, one of those things we should talk about, something that's interesting, but hopefully you'll get something out of this too. If nothing else, maybe gives you an opportunity also to say, hey, if I can set up the same kind of things that Eric is talking about, there's a possibility of me chasing this kind of client, right? So there's some things to talk about there. But let's go ahead and just get on this topic just a little bit. First and foremost, I'll just kind of give you a couple of images to show you what I'm talking about, and essentially to give you the the overall concept of what we originally ran. Now, the website that I'm going to show you, these are old captures from the original website I ran. If you go back to this website now, the new folks are running it in a different way, but these are now not only the people who I used to work for years and years ago, but now another generation of people owning this shop. So if you go to the same website that you might see on screen, it will not be the same now. But I'm going to show you some stills from the website. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fonts and files, and I'll talk generally about the way that we control these things and how I think it's important to kind of work with this stuff. So you'll see some old school looking website examples, but I think it still holds what is worthwhile, right? As far as how we can organize things, how we present things to people, and what made that a value add, right? So the first thing I'm just going to show you is the old school website. We're just going to go ahead and bring this up on screen and just kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about. So this is for a group called Presbyterian out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and in the surrounding regions. So Presbyterian Health System. It's no secret that we were servicing them at the time, so I don't think it's something that I'm letting out of the bag. They got serviced by other people as well, but we did the primary work at the time to kind of keep these folks running. But let's go ahead and grab the screen share and quickly kind of show you some of the stuff that's there. And then I might say hi to some folks, as I often do. But just to kind of show you what we're talking about, this is the original website. And yeah, super old school, but you can see phswear.com was the website. It is not the same now. But we had categories split out for all the different combinations. And as we can see with this little graphic here, each department or region had its own logo and text combination. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. In this case, it's very simple. This is probably the simplest version of this. It's why I like to use this one to teach. Because honestly, this is usually a single color. Now, often the colors are going to be transposed. In this case, the red is on both the black and white garments, but we had other garments that we can actually show you. Other garments did get other color combinations with this guy, but certainly that is mostly what we had. And generally, we were doing something like this. We were putting together some sort of garment, be it polos, be it scrubs, be it something of that nature that had the Presbyterian logo, which did not change generally for any of the groups that we were working with, but underneath it, we would have something like medical group here, which is the general one that everybody used, or we would have different versions of the logo as is necessary. So this is just something that we put together for these folks, right? So this is the concept. This is what we're working on. And this is, of course, the very old school version of this. It would look different in a modern setting. Certainly the website would be a little more modern than this is, but this is the website that I built at the time for the piece. And I think what's interesting to remark about this is just that throughout this process, there was time spent on and attention spent on the concept of how does someone find what they need? How do we let them understand that things are only for a certain department? And what do we do to make sure we're controlling that as best we can, right? So there's that. And I'm also going to talk briefly about other entities that we did this kind of work for and custom fonts and things like that and how that played into us getting more business from them and working with them long term. But yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about here. But this is a multi-division thing. And so the other thing I'm going to show you guys is what I consider kind of the case study, right? So what we're talking about, who we're talking about, and how did we service them? Now, another thing I want to discuss about this is who is the proper person. So this is a corporate e-commerce kind of thing, right? But who is the kind of person who's going to be the best for this work for someone like us to put in this kind of effort would be someone who's got, like we said, multiple divisions, maybe multiple locations. And certainly that was what was the case with Presbyterian, but multiple locations that are working with maybe similar logos or the same logo that has division names under it, that has some sort of other personalization. That is really, really ideal, especially if we can service them with a unified clothing line that we set up ahead of time. But that's part of what we have to realize is that getting this right and doing this brand management thing right isn't just about managing fonts, isn't just about managing logos, isn't just about managing colors. It's also about corporate pre-approval. So working with whoever it is that does the compliance over on the side of this company, and then setting up really clear policies. And that really also requires us to do very complete interviews with our clients. So that's what we're going to talk about today, right? So brand management, yes. Are we going to talk about commercial fonts? Yes, we are. Are we going to talk about style guides a little bit? Yes, we are. Am I going to show you some setup on how I used to do fonts back in the day versus how I do them now, and what I would do differently depending on software choices certainly, and what I currently use. So what do I do now in Stitch Artist when I want to set up a custom font versus what I used to do, and also the kind of transition between I need a couple of divisions for 2 or 3 different places versus I need a font that I can type in because I'm going to be doing all these different divisions and personalizations, but I need this corporate font. There is a transition point where we start with digitizing by hand a few different pieces, and then we move on to something where we want to make an entire font. We'll talk about that, right? So we'll get into that, but first let's go ahead and say hi to the folks that are here. You guys know that if you guys are tuned in live, I love to stop and say hi to everybody. So for the moment, if you're on the replay squad, by all means, jump out, fast forward, get to the meat of the topic. I'll throw either graphics up or I'll put back the banner so you can tell when it's time. But for those of you who are here, I'm going to say hi to everybody. So Cindy King coming out of Texas saying, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Cindy. Good to see you. We have Frank from over the UK being awesome and sharing and doing all the great things that Frank does. Good evening, Frank. Thank you for being here. For some reason, I'm just going to let you guys know there's a comment of mine that keeps on coming back up. It says, sorry for my streaming issues. I'm going to try to fix that comment. Something is up with the way that Evie Mux is doing studio. So if you see this comment, don't follow that link, folks. That is not the right link. That was from like 2 episodes ago. Something's up with Evie Mux. All right, let's talk to everybody else who is here, though. We've got Ron saying he's going to catch this on the replay squad. Thank you very much. And hopefully you have a great weekend yourself. Heidi is in saying hi to everybody. Love to see Lisa Shaw showing up. Says, good afternoon. Always a takeaway or 2 or 10 from your broadcast. Thank you, Lisa. My good friend and compatriot over at Brilliance, who also, her episodes always have 8 or 2 or 10 or 15 things you could take out of those as well. We have everybody saying hi to each other, which I always love. So I will let you guys keep talking in the comments if you want to. But for right now, let's jump back into this concept of brand management, of dealing with corporate e-commerce, and then dealing with all of the fun that goes with it. And yeah, I know you might catch me rolling my eyes and saying fun, but there is something to that. Sometimes things are just difficult, and this can be kind of a difficult thing to do. I think the real big thing to remember is that you have to be very clear. And like I said, this is the kind of time when you want pre-approvals. You want to talk to whoever it is in charge of these processes, but there are some good things that come out of this. Like I said, if you can find yourself the right client, and for my money, I am going to add extra banners while we're here, the right client is the most important thing for this kind of work. Because whenever I start talking about this stuff, somebody will stop and talk to me and say, hey, there's no way you can make this make money, dollars and cents, make the money make sense to me, that I'm going to interview these people this deeply, that I'm going to talk to them and get on board and get all of this stuff handled and be messing with style guides and digitize a font. You can't make that make sense to me. Well, honestly, I think I can. And here's how I'm going to explain it to you. There's a couple different use cases, and I'm going to go ahead and put one up on screen. I've actually taught this entire thing before. I've taught people how I feel about this. And so rather than going here, let's go ahead and actually get PHSware up as a case study. At a Shirt Lab event, I taught about everyday e-commerce. And when I did the everyday e-commerce unit, this was one of the examples I had. So this is what I'm going to talk about, right? So PHSware, this is the case study that we're going over today in general. And like I said, we will venture off into some others, but this is the one that I very specifically am talking about today. And this is what I want to kind of get across to you guys. This is a good client for this. Why? Well, number one, this is a medical group. This is not a single hospital or even 2. This is a medical group that had multiple hospitals and multiple clinics. So getting in on the ground floor, we started with some individual pieces for them. But when they started shopping around for e-commerce, we're looking at this going, all right, here is somebody for whom there is, and I'll go ahead and make this larger, there's high turnover. So the garments themselves are going to get destroyed pretty often. We know in the medical world, these things are getting washed, they're getting stuff on them, they're getting destroyed. High turnover of the garments. We also know that's a fair amount of hiring. If you haven't ever worked for the medical community before, that there are entire periods of the year where people are hired on, and often there are things like uniform credits. So there's both a top-down corporate buy that's going to happen from the company and a bottom-up buy from the employees if they need things that are outside of their accredited uniforms. There are possibilities for selling not only from the top down, but direct to consumer. So there's a lot going on here. There's multiple places that you can be selling to that all essentially use the same assets. There are definitely cases that the garments are going to turn over and get damaged because of washing and excessive wear. They're going to get turned over pretty highly. Another one of our big clients was a giant plumbing company, plumbing contractor. Let me tell you, that's another high turnover for the garments. We know there's actually high turnover for the employees. That's another good one for us. And in fact, worked for car washes and restaurants that have high turnover, and those were good clients as well to do this same kind of corporate work for. And so these are good clients. I'm not telling you to go digitize a font for the one restaurant down the street that sometimes comes in to get one piece of text done for their particular client. I'm not going to tell you to do that for one guy's lettering jobs that happen once every 6 months. That's not what we're talking about here. You have to have the right client for it. So before I kind of get that, you can't make sense of this sucker. By all means, understand the client you're working with. So let's go ahead and read this PHS where though. What made this valuable for us? Number one, we're in a partnership with the primary brand, meaning that when we entered into this, we actually had a contract. We were working directly with the corporate entity. We are not just one of the vendors. We actually had a contract with them. Number one, seamless integration with the IP. So we were going to provide direct contact with their in-house design staff. And I was the person who was doing the direct contact with the design staff and making sure that things were correct. So the design staff over there had all the corporate guidelines and were also dealing with compliance. And I dealt with both the compliance people and the design staff over there at the same time. We were licensed to produce images and to produce new stuff. So we could produce new garments, which we did. And we also did things that were outside of the uniforming. So event garments, stuff like that, we were also licensed to do. And I just had to have those, once again, cleared with the people over there with compliance. And we had to be very clear whether or not things were allowed to be worn on the floor. So could they be worn as part of the floor? So we also had the next big thing, a maintained stock. So we actually maintained some stock of these garments. And we had a dead stock guarantee. What did that mean is that if there was dead stock about every 6 months, if they had us maintain a certain amount of stock, when stock was there every 6 months, we had the opportunity to sell them stock at an agreed upon cost where they would have to pick it up. Or at the end of our contract, if they decided to walk out on the contract, that they would have to buy the remainder of the stock at the cost that we'd agreed upon in order to buy out of that contract at the end of this. The other things that were interesting about this, because we did direct-to-consumer distribution, is we did the distribution through interoffice mail. We would drop off all of our stuff labeled, don't get me wrong, labeled individually as orders, so it's very much still like e-commerce, but we dropped them off at a central location. The interoffice mail would take them the final mile, and they had to handle things when they weren't correctly done. The last things that are interesting, I'll go ahead and get my head out of the way just in case you don't see those. The voucher program. We had a voucher program by which I would generate vouchers that we were billing directly to corporate for those people who were buying in. So this is like gift certificates. Don't think of it as anything more complicated than that. Essentially, I was creating codes in the website that were redeemable for a certain amount of money or a certain amount of garments. And these were being billed directly to corporate. So we had prepaid vouchers that corporate was then giving away when it was time for people to re-up for their every year on their contract, or when people were being hired, they were given vouchers so they could also use this as their initial distribution of uniforms. But throughout all of this, we were also allowed at the end to do direct sale. We were able and allowed to do direct sales to the employees, meaning if an employee wanted something outside of what they were given, if they wanted to get extra more than they were allotted, they could come to us and buy directly, and we were not liable for that in any other way. We were able to sell directly, and we were able to market directly to the employees themselves. And this included a company store of items that were not part of the uniforming. And it was very clear that they weren't to be worn on the floor, or that if they were to be worn on the floor, they were not part of the uniform code. Meaning we had all those options laid out. So this is why I'm going to just kind of make it clear to you. when you go into a negotiation like this, if you're going to be doing a lot of work with somebody, look at what you have in front of you. Are these people going to have enough turnover to make sense of it? Certainly. And are you in partnership with them? Do they consider you a partner, or are you just another vendor? And even if you are just another vendor, can you get that pre-approval? Can you get the original art locked down? Can you get in writing that you're allowed to reproduce things? And can you get the ability to market directly without that being an issue? If you can get those things, you can make this worthwhile. And especially if you can get a contract like we had, where we had the ability to sell back dead stock. That is a massive thing. If you're going to go into this much work to set up a store, and especially if you are essentially warehousing for these folks, then you absolutely have to make something work with that. You have to make that part of the. I think it's the best part of what you can do with the contract is to try and get some sort of dead stock gear going on, even if, and don't get me wrong, just in time is the other way we handle this, and we did a lot of that. Even though we had multiple stores, we would try and keep a certain. We had some certain SKUs where we had colors that overlapped, and certain garments that we kept in stock that we kept blank, and we ran them as needed. For this particular uniforming, though, we did have some pre-decorated stock for the base uniforms, and we had, other than that, we did keep some blank stock on hand. Blank stock is a lot easier to get rid of, but still, we would still have the opportunity to sell that back as dead stock if it was purchased under the aegis of their stock, their ability to have instantaneous turnover on that stock. So that's what was going on with that client. You're not going to get that much of a sweet deal with everybody, but if you do, that's worthwhile. So you can see when we're talking about a corporate e-commerce thing, this is not just what I would do for any shop around the corner. Now, what I am going to say is, if you have a local entity that has a hard time getting things from anyone else, and they will either have to go, farther afield to get stuff, or you can create a font for yourself and or do some of this asset control and secure the bag for yourself. I still think there's a lot of case to be made for creating your own fonts, for doing a little bit of brand control, for doing e-commerce. Because honestly, adding that as a value add, it's amazing how much people are willing to pay and to stay local if they know that you are going to be able to provide them with all this stuff and be a solutions provider. So they don't have to go everywhere, do everything, do their own distribution, mess with all of this other kind of control too. So like I said, that's where we're at though. But in this case, for corporate e-commerce, this really was about them being able to hand off almost everything as far as their uniforming, and then for someone to be concerned with brand management. So what's the deal with this brand management concept? Well, really, it's not too much. You look at this, what we're doing here, you see all this kind of seamless integration with IP. All this means is we were very clear on what sort of IP we were using. So what garments got what graphics and who could wear them. Which is something you'll see whenever I'm showing one of these images from the website. Everywhere you go, number one, when you shop, you started from a category that was based in where someone worked first, not in the type of garment or who they were. So the first thing is providing a direct, easily navigable chain from the beginning, from the front page of that website down to where you could know for sure that if you worked in the Plains Regional Medical Group and you went to menswear and then you went to your department, you would get exactly what you were allowed to wear and the colors that you were allowed to wear. Not to mention, even if you got there some other method, let's say you started zipping around, you started using the search element, when you get here, you would say, all right, this is available for the clerical department. It is in red. It is very visible in this description. This garment is to be worn by the clerical department. And the other thing being that we were very clear when we did the pre-approvals, and in order to make sure these folks were happy, to match their fonts, their styles, and their style guide. And you guys have seen pictures of style guides before, so it's not like I'm really blowing your mind with this stuff, because I'll show you again my little mock-up style guide that I use rather than show everybody else's commercial style guides. We know for sure that that's the kind of concept that we're working with. We were always going to be using a style guide for that particular department. We're always going to be able to refer to things like how far letters should be apart, what things should look like, and certainly what fonts should be used. And this is one of the mock-ups that I often show here. this is one that I made up as just a mock-up for Black Duck, and that was the company that I worked at the time. And you can see what happens is you'll have a style guide that has something like this, where we will indicate things like clear space, how much space has to be in between letters. We indicate the fonts. In the case of this logo type, Impact was the primary font being used for that. We have X height, and we would say, all right, anywhere there has to be this much 1X height around the logo to make sure that nothing is stomping on that logo, that it is clear and nothing is in the way. And that's how we would handle that. So we would have that kind of setup in any sort of style guide, obviously. So this is how someone set up a style guide. But commercially, people were always kind of giving you these style guides, and you often had them. I know doing work for UNM is one of the other ones I showed, because I was one of the primaries in the department for working during their big redesign, where we did all the new logos, all the new type. It was a big turnover from what had been done for really almost decades before for the University of New Mexico. And you can see that their style guides also had things like what color combinations could be used. Could you use backgrounds? Could you use insets? Could you reverse colors? Things like that were all part of the style guide too. A lot of corporate entities are going to have something on that nature. Certainly, when we were dealing with PHS, it might not have been quite the same, but at the same time, we had a fair amount that we could work with as far as that. We had concepts of what had to be a certain size, especially when we're talking about division type, what font the font would be, or the type would be in, as far as the division names that went under the logos, how far apart they had to be from the logo, what the size had to be in reference to the logo so that it didn't offset it or become too primary in comparison to it. And so I think all of that is kind of part of that setup, right? We have to understand that style guide. We dealt with the corporate ahead of time and said, here's what that style guide looks like. And then we started originally just making our first few logos. And the funny thing is, everybody's going to think, because of my preponderance of font education, where I talk about typefaces all the time, I talk about creating corporate fonts, that you're going to say, all right, Eric, man, I'm sure that meant you went right straight to making a typable font. And that's not true. I mean, number one, surely I did play this game that we all do, which is close match or knockoff. Lots of people are going to say, hey, you're doing lettering that's not the primary logo. Why can't we just use close match type, something that's already keywordable in our fonts? Can't we use, Arial, even if it's not Arial, if it's close enough? Can we use something that's close? In this case, we got to talk about this particular logo type and say, that's really not going to work for these folks. Why is it not going to work for them? Well, a big portion of it is because these logos always appeared in concert with the rest of the logo type. So these things are always going to be right together. So when we're looking at the kind of stuff that we usually did for them, it was something like what I'm going to show you here. Presbyterian Children's Center. The Children's Center type is going to be directly underneath the primary Presbyterian logo. And if we've got it underneath the primary Presbyterian logo, it means that they are both directly together. And in this case, the typeface that we're using for this is a Franklin Bold Gothic. And then we also have a Franklin Bold Gothic Italic, right? So an oblique that we're using for the typeface underneath. In this case, Children's Center did have its own small logo, appended logo on the top. Most of them did not. Children's Center, and I believe the doctor's coats for the heart department would be the only people who are also using a special logo type that was not the same as everybody else. But here's the Children's Center logo with the original type. The funny thing is, you'll say, all right, I'm sure that means that Eric went out day one and started making Franklin, the Franklin Bold Gothic oblique type that went underneath all these things for the different departments. And the truth is, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. Did I do a corporate font eventually? Absolutely. But before that, did I use a close match? No, I did not. I didn't use a close match. I didn't use a stretched close font. The first thing I did was custom digitizing. The first thing I did from the very first moment was custom digitize the initial letters that I needed for the logo. And the thing was, it started out with Presbyterian Medical Group, and then we'd start doing all these other groups, and then I ended up with something that looked a little like this. We'll go ahead and go back over to this lettering group, and what you can see is I would have kind of this big slush file piece like this, where I had been working on all these divisions. Oh, pardon me. Been working on all these different divisions. And as I'm working on these different divisions, I would eventually get all these different fonts. I'd have it laid out, but I'm like, all right, I started out with medical group, Memorial Hospital's in there. I went, all right. Then I had that, and I had all these different setups, and I was like, all right, well, I can take the lettering from this. I can take the G off of patient navigator or the V. I'll take the dot off of this one. I'll grab this, and eventually, I got closer and closer to having a standard set of type. And I'm saying, all right, cool. I would eventually start putting these things all together. And this is something I did for a lot of different groups. I did the same thing originally with TLC, right? TLC was the big plumbing corporation, and theirs was a Euro style. And you'll see there's all these letters with pieces all over the place. Do you see all these weird jump stitches? It's because originally these were not in any sort of order. I collected them together after they came from individual names that we started out with. So when I did the very first medical group, I didn't go straight into digitizing everything. I did something that looks very much like this. I set this out in true type font, as you would expect, or open type font. And I went, all right, Presbyterian Medical Group. And then I digitized the letters that were in Medical Group. And then we did the first of the next setups. We're like, okay, well, maybe we're going to do the Dan C. Trigg Memorial Hospital, or we're going to do, telecommunications, or the financial counselor, or Socorro, or radiology, whatever it is. Now, this has all these different groups. And actually, I did this in a different software. So I'll briefly pop over to that software, as you can see, or a version of that software, because I did a lot of these in Wilcom. I now do everything in Stitch Artist, as you guys know, and in Brilliant Stitch Artist. But we'll just try and, if we can get everything to behave while I'm trying to scan this here. Okay, let me pull this back out here. I'm just going to go back out to the other side for a second. For some reason, my keyboard commands are not responding as I'm expecting them to. They're bouncing all over there. All right, here we go. So now here we have this again. Let me grab that back in. For some reason, it's my keyboard's getting stolen by different different software as I go back and forth. My focus is getting stolen. We can see that we had like the human resources departments over here. We had Dr. Dan C. Trigg, though it's all broken up now. And these are just objects, right? These are not fonts. These are objects. If we went to break these up, if we ungrouped them, you would see that individually these are all these different objects, and none of this stuff is particularly in any other part of that sequence. It's just objects. None of this stuff is a font. None of this is typable. Some of them are grouped, some of them are not, because originally I'm copying and pasting and moving this stuff all around. And that's great, and that's fine. What I'm going to say is eventually you get to a point like I did with the TLC names, and like I did with, we had a big group of car washes. That's another place at a high turnover, multiple locations. So that's another good person to do this kind of work for, though they didn't do e-commerce with us, but called Mr. Car Washes. And we did the same thing here. This one was, believe this is Georgia. So this is going to be Georgia bold italic that this guy is. But if we look at this one, it's another one of those ones where, I started out with some of the font, and then I eventually went back and did everything. I did the first round of names by just doing them custom because it really didn't make much of a difference. Once the layout got onerous, I then had to make my own, right? So I did a couple of the first names, the first 5 names probably by themselves. When we realized they were going to come back and do some more orders and we got some more solid lockdown with those folks, we did that. And then the same thing happened with Presbyterian. The first jobs for Presbyterian were just individual jobs. Once we went back and locked them down, then I did a font, right? And the same thing is the case with all of these, right? You would then lock them down. Back when I was in Wilcom, because we don't really have a font sheet, what I would do is do layout. I kind of talked about this last week with the way that I use tools differently. This is a layout where you can see these stitch lines are being my X height or my M height. These are the top and bottom lines for ascenders, descenders, or the height of the baseline font. You can see this one does have descenders below and ascenders above, things like that. But this was the Euro style italic font that I used for the TLC plumbing folks. But I did do a custom font that matched exactly with the rest of their corporate stuff. Same thing with the font for Mr. But the thing is, these days, I don't have to do this kind of cobbling together. And I would say, honestly, the way that I do things now, I probably wouldn't have done this. I do this for the first logo or two, maybe just for the medical group. But once I lock somebody down and we do have a contract with them, or even if we're flirting with that contract, the chances are I'm going to make a font. And I'm just going to show you briefly, because we have the ability to do so. In Stitch Artist 3, it's a very different world. When we're generating, I'm not having to create all this stuff from base art anymore. If I'm in the create mode in Stitch Artist 3, I would literally say create. I'm going to create a font page. And in this case, because we're talking about, Franklin, which is the one we're using, Franklin Gothic, and we're talking about a heavy italic, I'm going to say right. And I might make it a little large to start. It doesn't matter as much as long as I know what my scale is going to be. But I probably will eventually try and get them at scale. Right now, I'm just going to do 24 point, but the points don't mean all that much when you first start. And I'm just going to say, okay. And luckily, what Stitch Artist 3 is going to do for me is actually provide me with baseline graphics. Both the vector objects and the reference objects are going to be here. So we're both going to have a reference graphic behind it, and we're going to have vector objects if I want to use the vector objects to digitize from. And generally, I'm going to probably scale these back down. In this case, these are a little too tall. These guys are, that's 24 mils or so, 22 mils. So that's something where that's a little bit big for the kind of pieces that I was doing. And maybe I would decide to create that or recreate that, bring that in a different size. Or I might just grab this entire thing and scale it down, because I know that most of my stuff is going to be at about a 12 mil X height. That's going to be, roughly half of this. I might just go in here and scale this entire thing down to, 50% of its original scale, which is always an option to do. You just go ahead and do that. And then I would work this at scale. Now, honestly, I probably wouldn't do that because I forgot to select all my reference graphics before I did that. But you can see what I'm talking about now. These days, with the tools that I have in Stitch Artist, I'm much more likely to just go ahead and go in there and create an entire font page. Even if I wasn't going to use the entire font page to start, I could start filling in those fonts or those letters. Even if I was going to place them, I wouldn't probably place them manually because the creation of the font page is so easy. I probably wouldn't bother placing them manually at all. I would just go ahead and start with the letters that I needed to get through my one order. But, I would still think about, dropping those in here, and I can start those out in this case. And by the time I picked the wrong version of this guy, but I would probably start this out, start using the letters that I needed to, and then I could still use it as a typable font. It just wouldn't have the fully published versions of all the letters that I needed. And that's really just because the ease of publishing is a lot better than when I used to have to select individual letters. And you can see actually here, if I go back and show you, we had the one Euro style font source for TLC. This is the original source I used to use, where in order to switch a letter or map a letter, I would select one letter and then do this whole mapping routine. But then eventually I turned it into a proper font object for Stitch Artist 3, where I can go in here and I've got individual letters that when I make the changes and just go ahead and go through the publishing process, I can just go in here and say create publish font. And then I actually get the ability to publish that for myself and go ahead and work with it under that. And it will just be in my library as that font from that point on. I can just go ahead and use that Euro style Eric. Now I actually have that to be, addressed, and I can mess with it down the road. Now I didn't mess with any of my spacing or anything on this one. It wasn't on this system to go from. So I'd have to probably play with my spacing and my default sizes and all that. But at least it would be present. Like I can tell definitely that I should have stopped and done my spacing on that. But even without doing that, I think that's probably how I would lay it out rather than doing this individual shuffling in of letters where I'm dragging them all into place. But this is all just to tell you that, honestly, you don't have to go immediately to digitizing the entire corporate font. It's not necessary to just go ahead directly to when you're doing your corporate fonts to digitizing an entire alphabet, let alone is it necessary for you to go through and do every letter, every accent, everything. And in fact, if you'll look at that Euro style font that I did for TLC, or even if you look at the Mr. font, I started doing them just A to Z, just upper and lower, and nothing else. So if I go and pop one of those back open, it's like I said, it's just A to Z, just upper and lower. That's what I started with. I didn't do anything more than that in the original font source. And in Presbyterian, when I first did their lettering, it was literally just the names that I needed. And then I started to drag them around and make the individual names until I realized that I was going to have the entire lettering set up, and I wanted to be able to type it from that point on. So it really depends. Plus, if you are only doing division names, you might never need to do more than just custom digitize each one as it comes. Because if you're only doing 5 different locations and they don't do any personalization, we aren't ever going to see individual personalization or names or anything that changes on a regular basis. That might be enough. I would still tell you guys, though, instead of making commercial fonts, I still think you are going to have to be doing brand management. And I would definitely not use a close match, because close match, like I've said this a million times, a close match font, when it is on the same spot with the logo, when you are sitting there in the same location with the logo, very much. And especially if you use it in lieu of, if you try and use it in a logo type, especially, or next to a logo type, maybe secondarily, it makes the entire piece that you're working on look like a knockoff version. It looks like your Timu version of the actual logo you're working for. And I think that's just the worst thing you can do for brand management. And it makes it look amateurish. And honestly, when you're dealing with larger uh, corporate entities, they're not going to love that stuff. So you don't want to do close matches because it looks like a knockoff. It looks like a rip of their brand and not anything better than that. The other things I'm just going to kind of make clear about that. The other reasons I do commercial fonts like this, where I do produce an entire font, is certainly vendor lock-in. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody come back to us saying, yeah, they let us go where we want to go for stuff, but then they gave us a style guide and it says we have to have X font. Do you have it? Now, don't get me wrong. Lots of embroidery shops these days may try and use automatic conversion of true type fonts and give them exactly what they ask for. The quality of that true type conversion, even to this day, even with modern software, is not always wonderful. It's not at least as good, certainly, as a digitizer having worked on those pieces. And especially if you think of, and I should probably throw some better background color here, but I'll just go ahead and throw this back up so we can talk about it. When you're talking about something like this, where, we can see that those are 1 centimeter grids that we're working on. These letters get pretty small. They're not tiny, but they're down at the kind of theoretical limit for 40 weight thread standard needles. This small e digitized in a way that is not compensated correctly for push and pull is not going to look very good. If someone just used a true type to create that, things like, you can see how the dots over here on the lowercase I have an extra space in them. They're definitely slightly higher than the rest of the type, just a little bit for that adjustment. And they have extra space in there to make them keep from closing up, despite the fact that is not how it would look on the true type. We actually have these short arms on the R's. We have increased space in the aperture on the E, on the S. These things have been altered so they run nicely. That's not going to be the case of somebody using a true type conversion. So even if they go to some other company that didn't do the full digitizing of their specific corporate font, they're either going to get a piece that doesn't look right. So they walk onto the floor and somebody goes, what did you get? Where is that from? It looks like a knockoff. It's not up to spec. It doesn't look like everybody else's stuff. Or they're going to get something that does have the right font, but then the execution's not quite as good and it's still not going to look right. The chances are they're going to say, hey, next garment you get, go back to our approved vendor. Don't go out of house for that. Can they do the same thing you did? Surely they can. Anybody who's listening to me is very likely to do something like that. They're likely to go ahead and digitize their font. But the thing is, if they don't go to that trouble, then you end up just kind of being the lock. If you have the right font and if you have the rest of the knowledge that we talked about earlier, we have that corporate pre-approval. We have clear policies. We've done a complete interview and we know exactly why they have things like colors that are on certain parts of the floor, that we have people who have different ranks in the hospital, or at least different positions in the hospital have different colors of their scrubs. And we know what logo goes on what color and how big it is allowed to be and exactly what size and what layout it should be. Understanding that and understanding the full pre-approval and the clear policies about that, both our policies with the company have to be clear, but also the policies that the company has about the usage of their logos have to be very clear. That creates vendor lock-in. We are more likely to be the person they go back to, because honestly, it's just too much trouble outside of the of the system to get what you want. It's very much like piracy, right? If you guys don't know about this, like software piracy, music piracy, movie piracy, it tends to die out if the systems that are there to buy are easy enough and priced decently enough to use. People just stop pirating. There was a period of time not very long ago in the history of digital music where 75% of music was pirated. Services like Spotify came along and now it just doesn't exist. Now, people also don't own music very much. They stream it. They don't own it as much as they used to. But the concept of piracy was everything in that space. And then certainly there was some punishment that went on, but that wasn't all of it. A lot of it went away because it was easy. It was easy to get the music you wanted and listen to it. If you make your e-commerce, if you make your decoration, your customization, your name drops easy to use, easy to get, correctly set up for the corporate entity, for the style guide, If you are the easiest version of this thing, you don't necessarily even have to be the cheapest. In fact, you often don't have to be the cheapest at all. If you are the one with whom they can select the garment, they know what it's supposed to be, they get the logo that's intended, and they can run that out, the likelihood is you're the top choice, because they're not going to want to go to the trouble of figuring it out, especially you've got a hire. This is not a larger order or a group order. If this is an individual hire that is coming for garments, and that's something that also the organizers over at the corporate entity don't want to deal with, having to have people come in with wads of money in their hand, having people come in and having to figure out where they need to go and when they can pick stuff up. If you can figure out the way to do the distribution set portion of that too, you can charge more, and you can be the vendor lock. It's just something that is worth thinking about, right? So, like I said, these are some of the things I want to just kind of put in your mind, that thinking about brand management is something that even for smaller shops, even for small towns, can be useful, especially when you're dealing with the kind of clients for whom that corporate stuff is important. Because the thing is, even if we're talking about where we can sell outside of our immediate locality, you can end up being the servicer for a larger, multi-state, national group of people. I know we did. We serviced some brands that were big national brands and sometimes international brands. And it was our ability to move in the right way, to have that approval, to have the style guides in mind, to create the corporate fonts, and to manage that stuff, to kind of make the system that managed that and to care about that stuff, that made us the proper choice for folks. And people would just kind of default to continuing to use our stuff. So it is interesting to do that. Now, we do have a concept here we should look at. Joanne says, you may have covered this, but is it up to the customer to purchase licensing for a font that's downloaded from a font site? Yeah, I mean, I hate to say this, there are different feelings about this. Let me just say that in the United States, the shapes that are in a font. So let's talk about typefaces and fonts real quick, and this is something that I get into. So we're gonna get this right. In fact, I'll make a banner for this so we can talk about this in a second here. So we talk about commercial licensing. First thing is, buying a commercial license for the font for yourself as someone who's going to be using it is a great idea. You're going to want a good commercial copy of that font. But there is something to be said about this, right? So typefaces versus fonts, right? And I'm going to bring this up, and we're going to talk about what the issue is and why I think this kind of gets sticky, and especially in the US, right? Typefaces versus fonts. A typeface is, I'm just going to define this for us today, are the shapes that are there, the actual drawn shapes of the letters that are there, that the way the typeface looks, right? That is based in, and especially if it's based on an older metal typeface from back in the days of typeset printing, these typefaces, these shapes exist. But then there are fonts. Fonts are a digital product. They are collected and drawn, these vectors, and those parts, those portions are a package. It is an item that is separate. It is a digital product. It is an item that is not just the typeface. It is all the work that went into creating this packaged digital product. So a font can be protected as a digital product, but the shapes of the letters inside of that font, and I'm not a lawyer, so go talk to a copyright lawyer to be absolutely sure, but in the US, up to this point, those shapes of those letters are not under copyright in the same fashion. So once you, as a person who is creating your own interpretation of these into embroidery, has created a font from that typeface, whatever the source was you worked on. Now, if you just upload those straight vectors and you use those vectors and you don't do any work on them, and the existing letters are there from the vector source that somebody gave you, there might be some fuzziness there. But if you bring in your typeface, whatever it is, with it, using the font or whatever, and then you draw brand new shapes in embroidery, which you're going to break up serifs, you're going to break up those shapes, you're going to change things about them to work at proper sizes, and then you make that new product, as long as you don't use the name or the trade dress or any of the items, the descriptions, or anything that went into that font or the packaging of the font, it is hard for it to be defensible. It doesn't mean it's not the right thing to get commercial licensing. I think it's a great idea. You should probably get commercial licensing for a font you're going to use in this matter. You should have a good licensed version of the font for yourself, but you are not distributing the font. You are selling garments that are based on a new, honestly, an entirely new digital thing that you've created that happens to feature the typeface. So this is a stickier wicket than a lot of the things that we talk about. If you look at the typefaces in most modern embroidery software, there are a lot of overlaps. There are a lot of ones that look very similar to each other, but if you looked at the vector behind them, you'd find that where dots are, where nodes are, where angles are, how objects are broken up would be different. But if you looked at them on their face, are they the same typeface? Are the shapes of the letters the same? Very similarly, often the names are changed. Almost always, but often the names are changed. Not always. Sometimes they are, and that's already flirting with whoever may own a particular name as you know, as part of like the kind of dress around the thing. But the typeface itself in the U.S. is really hard to protect. Is not protected in the same way as, let's say, a drawing of a character would be. And I mean not a character like a letter. I mean a drawing of an object or a mascot and anything else aside from this. The letters of the alphabet are just not protected in the same way. So it's just something to say that, yeah, you're going to see people with the same lettering styles that are exactly the same shapes, drawn slightly differently with different names on them. And I think you're in that same boat, especially when you're doing something corporate where you're not giving them the typeface in any way, shape, or form. You are selling shirts. So I think that's the thing. And you're not producing them as a print. So this is not me printing things from that. I'm using this as an original. I am now creating my own object out of that. And also, if you're doing this as a corporate internal thing, I'm not even selling the font file I made. So we're generations removed from that original typeface. Like I said, I know your original question is really should the customer have licensing? You as the person who's going to make this thing, I would price that in and buy a real copy of the font. I'm not going to pretend I always did. I used types, especially when you have typefaces that are out in the world that have been from old metal type originals that don't exist or didn't exist as fonts, and then later somebody came back and made them into fonts. And so you have multiple different fonts that all look roughly the same, executed different ways. I'm not going to pretend that I always went and bought the most expensive one in a normal shop. No. But the thing is, when we go to release this stuff, we really aren't releasing that font back into the world. We're not producing a digital piece that then it has parts of that thing that's created by somebody else. Everything's being redrawn, and typefaces, at least in the United States of America, do not have that kind of protection. Though there are other places where there are protections. So your mileage may vary. Your country may do this differently. Make sure it makes sense for your particular country and license as appropriate. I am not a lawyer. Go seek a copyright lawyer if you're concerned with that. But I would say, for us, for our purposes, making our own embroidery font that we then use to customize shirts, it would be a hard run for someone to say that we're redistributing anything of theirs. So that's kind of what we're feeling. So, and Joanne says, very good explanation, Eric. I don't know if it's a great explanation. It is the one that I know that we're mostly operating under. And you're going to find most embroidery companies are. Also, if you go into any font site, you are going to find fonts that are in other people's collections, and they may or may not be direct knockoffs or spit, and I call them spit out versions, where somebody may have gone to a piece of software, spit their files out as different formats, and then re-uploaded those or created them in some different format. I know that is a very common practice. If you go to any Etsy font collection, the chances are that you're going to find a native font from somebody's software rendered out into 3 sizes as stitch files is super high. That's just a reality. That's a little dicier by far. That really is redistributing in a fashion. But even that is hard to defend. And you'll certainly, with no compunction, find very similar faces like typefaces. You will find, some version of a Helvetica or a Swiss that's probably exactly the same shape for shape in multiple softwares that are named different things. And as far as the US is concerned, at least, that really is not a big problem. But yeah, would I personally buy a format of that's commercial? Surely. Would I go out and try and tell them how many shirts a year I'm doing if I'm going to digitize my own embroidery version of that and then use that? No, I don't think that's necessary. But like I said, I'm not a lawyer. Go seek a lawyer's advice if you want to find out. The other thing is the concept of that being actionable. They'd have to know, they'd have to care. You'd have to be doing enough damage for someone to actually want to do something to you. And I think that's a hard road to hoe. But your mileage may vary. I would definitely not do it with products from, like, let's say Disney has a typeface. Don't do that. It's just, those are the litigious people. You don't want that. You've got something that mocks the Harley logo. Don't do that. They're litigious. They come for you. You've got a metal typeface that's been around for 100 years and everybody's got a version of it and you want to make one. I wouldn't be too concerned. All right, folks. So let's kind of get back to the meat of this thing just for a little bit. I know we talked just a little bit about kind of everything that's involved with this thing. I know we show is why do I think that this kind of corporate control stuff is important for us, and why do I think that we are very well positioned, even when we're talking about people who are like third bedroom producers, smaller producers, is that when you do lots of personalization, you're known to do lots of personalization, having the ability to do something that is very professional like that, it is not something that necessarily has to be done by a larger shop. And I think that's something that people kind of get in the way. They think of this as a very large shop mentality. They think that you have to be in a big corporate mill to do this stuff, but it's absolutely not the case. I think that there is a case to be made that for boutique shops, smaller shops who have a tendency to charge a little more, to have some more overhead for this kind of stuff, and for you to spend the time, because we often, if you're somebody who's in a smaller shop situation, you tend to spend a little more time, a little more effort on individual personalization, on getting to know your clients. I think that we can combine that with a little bit of what it might be seen as a little bit glossy corporate polish to put this stuff together and say, there's not really much different between the concept of taking your time with something artistically, with taking care of someone and their needs, being very deep with what they want to get out of individual pieces, the same way we would for, like I said, boutique fashion pieces, for individual gift pieces, for individually personalized things that have people's names on them, that have colors and sizes attached to them. The same kind of time you would take to do a team sports piece, it's very similar for corporate wear of this nature. And I think that's the funny thing. When I've talked to people about this, they tend to see them as very separate. They tend to see this stuff as something that sounds very soulless and doesn't seem like a smaller shop would engage in it. But we have to do the same kind of organization anyway. If you're somebody who right now is dealing with a couple of local club volleyball teams with all the sizes and colors and the names that have to go on things and making sure the spellings are all correct and doing name drops under a logo, which is very similar to what we do with high schools and anything else, this is really not alien. The only thing that might be a little bit different is looking at a style guide and doing measurements. Not very hard. We usually have to talk about stuff, like I said, clear space, things like that. But though these are design terminology, they're not that strange. It really just is, how far from the logo can I put the text? How big can this be in this space? And having the same conversation we would have about a high school team mascot and the fact that it's getting a little big for hats. It's the same conversation we'd have. We would talk to somebody ahead of time and say, hey, you've got these kinds of garments. The neckline's like this. It has a certain spacing that has to go there. We really need about this much spacing in order to get this many characters in there. Can I take a longer name and drop it into 2 lines or not? Does that work? That kind of stuff is the same that we would do for individual logos if we do this in advance as part of getting that corporate pre-approval, right? As part of getting that initial approval so that we know exactly where we're going, that we have that sign on for the people who are doing kind of compliance, we can then make a document that is no different than our usual job documentation for any other custom piece. Any other piece is going to have a high level of customization. So I want people to understand that the only difference that I'm probably presenting to you guys that is really all that different from working on event garments for your local events, working on team sports, working on anything else that has a fairly high level of customization, and that requires you to maybe do individual packaging, which a lot of team sports do, for you to do distribution to individual players on teams. This stuff is not different. It's mostly about doing more work on the lead end. And then the second half of that really is just about commercial font setup. It's about setting up custom fonts. So if you throw custom fonts into this, and then let's say e-commerce, okay, then really what's the difference with e-commerce? E-commerce is more about just clear policies in this case. It's that if we're doing this for a corporate entity, we want to talk about things like what's going to happen to dead stock down the road. We're going to talk about who can wear what. It's going to be a long-term thing. And in fact, I would say this kind of setup, this kind of work with style guides, this kind of concept of working toward getting vendor lock-in means that your e-commerce site is likely to stay the same for longer than any team sports site, definitely any event site. So you're really not doing much more work than you would do for, like I said, your local high school. You are going to set this thing up and get it set up with that vendor lock-in with all the stuff that you would do. And the chances are they're going to not change that art nearly as often as any other client. So the real mix that might be different, that might be a little scarier, is just that we are literally just looking at something that's a little more polished than the fact they might have a style guide or might be a little bit more willing to contest with you about details that you have to work on. And then just creating our own corporate fonts. And the other thing I would like to make clear to folks is that aside from the necessity of, depending on your software, buying into a level of software that allows you to publish your own fonts. And don't get me wrong, that is the other buy-in that it requires of us if we're going to do this as keyboard, typable customization that we can do on the fly with a custom font. Really, it's not any different than just custom digitizing any other sort of logo. And honestly, you can work with, provided you have a digitizer that's willing to do so, you can work with a digitizer who's willing to give you working files and do the thing that I showed you, earlier on. You can do the whole, as goofy as it might look at first, you can do this entire digitize each group as it comes in thing and borrow letters from them and line them up with a guideline or with the grid. You can continue to line these things up and work on them and reuse elements of them over and over if you don't want to get into that. What I would say is it doesn't take very long for this kind of work not to make as much sense as, setting up your own font and digitizing it once. I think there comes a point pretty early if you're going to do that customization, or if you really think you've got a client on the hook who has the ability, who has the potential, who's got that turnaround, that you're just going to say, the chances are I am going to want to create something for these people. I'm going to want to have something on the road that's going to make sense for a permanent addition, that you're just going to work on this stuff and not have to mess with it, especially when we have the ability to say, hey, I want this heavy italic. I'm going to go ahead and throw that down and I'm going to make this piece and I'm going to digitize it once and have it forever. Now that it is a similar thing to working on a custom design, and the output is really about as easy as doing any other kind of file output. If you have that ability, it really doesn't make a lot of sense not to make a typable version of it, because this takes the same kind of time, if you ask me, at this point, as this. Dragging all these things into individual positions and having to mess around with those all on that line and line stuff up and kind of get it back into some shape that works. The chances are digitizing your own version of them, setting yourself up a version of these on a metered sheet that's got guidelines and baselines and all the things that you require for alignment and publishing. It really is kind of a wash to me, especially if you're just going to do upper lowercase on simple fonts like this, which a lot of the corporate stuff is. The thing is, you don't also have to do it all at once. Like I said previously, even if you don't want to drag all this stuff in, if you do get the tools, whether you buy the font publishing unit, if you're over on Wellcom, you get that additional unit, or maybe it comes with whatever version you currently have, depending on what the upgrades are coming with these days. Or if you're on Stitch Artist 3, let's say you're in Stitch Artist 2 and you go up to Stitch Artist 3 within Brilliance, where we do have font publishing, you can publish a portion of a font. It doesn't have to have every letter in it for you to have a typable version of it, and you might be able to get away with not digitizing every letter until you need it if you really are concerned about that additional digitizing time. I still think that having font creation is really a wonderful tool, especially if you're going to be doing lots of custom personalization. And let me also remind you that if you're doing things in the world of that boutique kind of gift world, bridal world, whatever it is, there also can be a world where you go out into the kind of trends that are in the world and find that there are no embroidery fonts for a hot, trending, open type font that's being used for print goods in the world of, let's say, the bridal world. And you decide for yourself, like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to jack this trend that is currently going out with all of these print goods, and I'm going to make sure that I've got a matching font to the hot print good fonts that are out there right now. And if I create that matching typeface and embroidery and advertise it, I've got a match that people can use on their embroidered garments, and nobody else has it right now. You can use it for a point of differentiation in lots of verticals. So I think that's interesting. But ultimately, I think that the scary parts of this kind of corporate brand management, it's really just attention to detail. You know, corporate e-commerce is the same as any other e-commerce, any other sales. Making sure that you are attentive to somebody's art, understanding that a style guide is really just a encapsulated corporate version of somebody's preferences. You know, that's what it really is the preferences and the original art that was there from the people who are on high. And that the real difference is just the ability to create your own corporate fonts, or at the very least to make sure that when you are making text for something, we don't get in that stock font mindset. And if we can't find stock fonts for something, we get out and say, all right, that's something that either I am going to digitize or have somebody digitize, so that I am not having that concept of, you know, the knockoff logo, the Timu brand logo version of whatever this corporate entity is hired me to create. I mean, I've shown it a million times. I don't know if I had this on tap. I don't know if I've got it to bring up, and hopefully I do. Actually, yeah, I do. Let me pop up the logo that I always do this with. If you are going to the store, this is a kind of a weird version of this, but bear with me. And you go, do you want the Snickers or do you want the Snickers? We all know which one's the right one. We know which one's supposed to be on that bar of Snickers. And if we see two of them sitting next to each other and this one's just floating around in the middle of it, I think we all know which one we're going to trust to put in our mouths. It's probably not going to be the bottom one. Is it close? Sure. Does it look right? No, it's not the right logo. And if the logo is recognizable, and certainly in your local area, probably the hospital group that most people have gone to the most is going to be recognizable. I don't think we want to present that to a client and say, look at me, I can make this thing you've asked for. Here it is. It's just not, it's not the way we want to handle that stuff. And I think even when we're talking about corresponding pairs and corresponding typefaces, it still is a thing, especially when we realize that, very much like the weird off-brand Snickers in a pile of real ones, if we're doing uniforming, the chances are we are selling uniforms into a group of people who already have uniforms on hand, who already have people wearing their logo, who already have signage up, who have vehicles printed or wrapped. We have stuff all around us featuring the correct typefaces, because the print world is not going to do knockoff stuff. Generally, they're going to get the right typeface one way or the other, or they've got established print art. We really don't want our embroidery to stand out and look like that knockoff, and presenting that to our client saying, here's the best we can do because we don't want to spend the additional time. No matter whether you're making custom fonts to do that customization long term down the road, or you're just digitizing for one usage, digitizing on spec, making sure it's on model, on brand, is a useful thing. So, like I said, brand management doesn't have to be scary. And I think we're going to end it here. We're not going to jump on into 20, 30 minutes more of different stuff beyond that. Certainly a useful thing. And I think that that's something that we can stop, at least with this particular kind of question. I do have another thing I might answer real quickly, or at least bring up, but let's just say this: brand management doesn't have to be scary. Corporate e-commerce is the same as any e-commerce, as long as we're being careful with all of them. Uh, don't do close match knockoff fonts, certainly. Understand that style guides are a thing. Ask if your client has one. If they don't have one, look for it yourself. That's the other thing, is if you know that the brand is big enough, even if the individual person coming to you to try and set something up does not know that, stop and just look and see if there's a style guide available. A lot of big companies, universities, and schools will have one somewhere that is out in the world, and you can try and use that if it's possible. But the other thing is commercial fonts. it's no different than any other kind of digitizing you would do, but you want to plan ahead and understand that there are different methods depending on what software you're into make fonts. And I'm going to recommend that if you're into doing next level decoration, you want to do something that ups the ante and does something a little bit different than the next person down the road, making your own custom fonts is one of those options. And you can find people who do it. It is rarer than digitizers who just do regular digitizing, but even if they don't, you can have someone make up the characters in your custom font. Um, think about vendor lock-in, get approval ahead of time, and very, very clear policies are important, both between you and the corporate entity and between you and the individual purchasers on this stuff. So like I said, I think this is a useful thing to think about. And if you have any questions on this, if this is something you've ever gotten into, if you would like to know more about my thoughts on this stuff too, I'm absolutely here to talk about that. But I think it's something that's just an interesting kind of aside. I've seen more people talking about how they're handling not just font matches and stuff like that in a generic way, but seeing more and more people in the world of corporate business to business and even in smaller organizations being sticklers about detail. As design is something that people are more involved in and aware of, the barrier to entry into that world is smaller and smaller and smaller, as more and more people think of themselves as ambassadors of a brand, even if they're not large corporate entities, this stuff becomes more important. And you can corner the market if you're one of the people who cares about it, even if other folks don't. So if you guys have any other things that you want to talk about, ask about in the near future, I'd love to hear from you. I'm efforting a couple of interviews if possible. I'm also thinking about doing some small software specific pieces that might be done as individual videos, and maybe some small some pieces that are more related to process as shorter pieces, maybe not lives like this, because a lot of the stuff that I would love to do live, trying to do like a 3-camera setup, and turns out in the home that I'm in now, I am now stuck where office and streaming is on a completely different floor than embroidery because of some limitations of the building that I'm in. So originally I thought I would be doing more of like I'm streaming while I'm doing a process over here at the same time. That might be a little hard for me to do. So they might be pre-recorded pieces where I come in and do something like a premiere of that piece. So I might be doing a little bit tighter videos about certain processes, and then maybe premiering those and doing a Q&A after or around those. I would love to hear more if you've got stuff you want to hear from me, but jump in, answer here, get in the comments, find me on social. It's pretty easy. Go to ericcampbell.com and send me messages. I would love to hear more about what you want in the coming weeks. But with that, folks, get out there and try some of this stuff out. See in your software what it takes to create fonts. If you're in Stitch Artist, anybody with Stitch Artist 3 can create native fonts, and they're very useful. I use them for all manner of things, even beyond, as you might expect, normal uses that everybody else has. But I think it's something that's worthwhile to think about, and certainly look at typefaces, look at what people are trying to achieve, and just get a little deeper. Be willing to ask more, be willing to learn more about what your client is about, who they are trying to show their work to, who is going to be viewing their garments, do those complete interviews, and realize that when you care and when you solve problems, they're going to care about you. All right. So get out there, do some of that work, and certainly have a thought about making some fonts. Typefaces and fonts are something that I love, and I think you'll love them too. All right, folks, keep those needles moving. I can't wait to see you again next week.